Every now and then, something a person says at the very end of their life sticks with you in a way you never expected. Not because it was poetic or planned, but because of what came right after. In many cases, the last words a celebrity spoke were ordinary, even cheerful, and that is precisely what makes them so unsettling in hindsight. Tonight, we are going to visit the graves of 40 famous men and women whose final words, for one reason or another, turned out to be chilling. Some of them knew the end was near and said exactly what they meant. Others had no idea what was coming. And their last words became haunting only because of what happened next. These are real people buried in real places, and the stories are all true. We will travel from Memphis to Manhattan, from the hills of Hollywood to the mountains of Idaho, from a quiet cemetery in Jamaica to the hallowed grounds of Arlington. Along the way, you will hear last words that were funny, tender, defiant, heartbreaking, and in more than a few cases, downright eerie. So, settle in and let us begin. We start tonight at one of the most visited graves in America. It sits in a garden behind a white-columned mansion in Memphis, Tennessee, a place you probably already know by name, Graceland. This is the final resting place of Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll. Elvis is buried in the meditation garden alongside his parents, Vernon and Gladys, and his grandmother, Minnie Mae. Fans by the thousands still file past these graves every single year, many of them leaving flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten letters. Elvis changed the world. That is not an exaggeration. Born in a two-room shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi, in 1935, he grew up poor, singing gospel in church and soaking up the blues and country music that filled the air of the Mississippi Delta. His twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn, and Elvis grew up as an only child with a closeness to his mother, Gladys, that shaped his entire life. When he walked into Sun Studio in Memphis and recorded That's All Right in 1954, something shifted in American culture that would never shift back. By the time he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and shook his hips to Hound Dog, half of America was scandalized, and the other half could not look away. He sold more than 500 million records worldwide. He starred in 31 feature films, including Jailhouse Rock and Viva Las Vegas. He performed in Las Vegas to sold-out crowds night after night, reinventing himself as a jumpsuit-clad showman after his legendary 1968 comeback special. There was simply nobody like him, before or since. But by the summer of 1977, Elvis was only 42 years old and in serious physical decline. His weight had ballooned, he was dependent on a cocktail of prescription medications, and the grueling schedule of concerts had taken a visible toll. The man who had once moved like liquid on stage was now struggling to get through his sets. Friends and family were worried, but Elvis was not a man who accepted help easily. He had been the one taking care of everyone else since the day he became famous. On the early morning of August 16, 1977, Elvis could not sleep. He and his fiancée, Ginger Alden, were at Graceland, and he had a concert scheduled the very next evening in Portland, Maine. His bags were already packed. Around 4 in the morning, Elvis got out of bed. Alden stirred and asked where he was going. His last words to her were entirely unremarkable. He told her he was going to the bathroom to read. She reminded him not to fall asleep in there, and he said he would not. Hours later, Alden found him unresponsive on the bathroom floor. He was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital, but it was too late. The king of rock and roll was dead. There is something about those words, so mundane, so domestic, so far removed from the glittering spectacle of his life, that makes them linger in the mind. The most electrifying entertainer of the 20th century spent his last conscious moments not on a stage, not in a spotlight, but padding across a bedroom floor in the small hours of the night, headed for the bathroom with a book. He was 42. His official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, though the role of prescription drug use has been discussed and debated ever since. More than 45 years later, roughly 600,000 people still visit Graceland every year. Elvis has not left the building, not really. From the legendary grounds of Graceland, let us travel northeast to New York, where another kind of legend spent her final hours in a very different mood. Joan Crawford was one of the biggest movie stars of Hollywood's golden age. For more than 4 decades, she commanded the screen with a fierce intelligence and an almost frightening intensity. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Mildred Pierce in 1945, a role she fought hard to get after being dismissed by Warner Brothers as box office poison. She starred in Grand Hotel alongside Greta Garbo and John Barrymore, and decades later she delivered one of the great camp performances in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, alongside her great rival, Bette Davis. Crawford's feud with Davis became almost as famous as their films. Davis once said of Crawford that she had slept with every male star at MGM except Lassie. What many people forget about Crawford is that she was not born into anything resembling Hollywood glamour. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas, in 1904, and her childhood was marked by poverty and instability. She worked as a laundress and a waitress before winning a Charleston dance contest that led her to a career in show business. Everything she became, she built from nothing, and she never let anyone forget the distance she had traveled. Crawford spent her later years in a Manhattan apartment, largely out of the public eye, her health failing. She had become a board member of Pepsi-Cola after the death of her husband, Alfred Steele, the company's chairman, and she took the role seriously, showing up at shareholder meetings in full Joan Crawford regalia. But by 1977, the years had caught up with her. On the morning of May 10th, she suffered a fatal heart attack. Her housekeeper was at her bedside, and as the end drew near, the housekeeper dropped to her knees and began to pray aloud. Crawford, even in her last moments, was not a woman who tolerated uninvited performances. She snapped at the woman with words that could have been a line from one of her films. "Damn it, don't you dare ask God to help me." Those were Joan Crawford's last words. She was 72. Crawford was cremated, and her ashes were placed in a niche at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, alongside Alfred Steele. Even in death, Joan Crawford got the final word. Let us lighten the mood considerably and head to Southern California, to the grounds of the San Fernando Mission in the northern reaches of Los Angeles. This is the final resting place of Bob Hope, a man who spent nearly 80 years making people laugh. Hope hosted the Academy Awards ceremony a record 19 times. He starred in more than 50 films, including the beloved Road to Movies with Bing Crosby, a partnership so effortless and so popular that audiences felt like they were watching two old friends having a good time, which in fact they were. And for decades, through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf War, he traveled the world entertaining American troops through USO tours. No entertainer in history did more for military morale. Congress honored him as the first and only honorary veteran of the United States Armed Forces. What made Hope remarkable was his durability and his timing. He was born in Eltham, England in 1903, came to America as a child, and was still performing in the 1990s. He worked in vaudeville, on Broadway, in radio, in film, and on television, mastering each medium as it came along, which is something almost no other performer has done. His comedy style was based on the quick one-liner, delivered with a cocky grin and impeccable rhythm, and he was so fast with a joke that he set the template for every stand-up comedian and late-night host who followed. He played golf with presidents. He told jokes to soldiers in foxholes and to kings in their parlors. He was so wealthy from his entertainment career and his real estate investments that it was said he owned more land in California than any other individual. Bob Hope lived to be 100 years old. When he died in July 2003 of pneumonia, his family held a private dawn funeral mass at the Mission. But the best part of the story happened before that. In his final days, when his wife Dolores asked him where he wanted to be buried, Hope, a man who had spent his entire life delivering punchlines, did not miss his last one. He looked at her and said, "Surprise me." They did. He and Dolores now rest in a memorial garden on the Mission grounds. It is a peaceful spot befitting a man who gave so much joy to so many people, and who could not resist a joke, even at the very end. Now let us cross town to the Westwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, to a surprisingly small and understated cemetery called Westwood Village Memorial Park. Do not let the modest size fool you. Tucked between office buildings and high-rise condominiums, this little patch of ground holds more star power per square foot than just about any cemetery in the world. And one of its most celebrated residents is Humphrey Bogart. Bogart was the tough guy with the tender heart, the trench-coated star of Casablanca, the Maltese Falcon, the African Queen, for which he won his only Academy Award, and The Big Sleep. He was a man who could deliver a line like no one else in the business. Here's looking at you, kid, and of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine. Those lines live because of how he said them, with that slight lisp and that world-weary knowingness. What most people do not realize is that Bogart was a late bloomer. He spent much of the 1930s playing forgettable gangsters in B pictures before The Maltese Falcon in 1941 finally gave him a role worthy of his talent. He was 41 years old before he became a star. His love affair with Lauren Bacall, 25 years his junior, became one of Hollywood's great romances. She was 19 when they met on the set of To Have and Have Not in 1944. He was 44 and married to his third wife. The chemistry between them was so electric on screen that audiences could feel it through the celluloid. They married in 1945 and stayed together until his death. Bogart was a heavy smoker his entire adult life, and in the mid-1950s, he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. He fought it as long as he could, enduring surgery and radiation, but by January 1957, it was clear the end was near. He had lost so much weight that his friend Spencer Tracy, visiting him at home, was shaken by what he saw. On the night of January 13th, Bacall had to leave their home briefly to pick up the children. Bogart looked at her and said, "Goodbye, kid. Hurry back." She did hurry back, but Bogart had slipped into a coma from which he never woke. He died the next day at the age of 57. Some people over the years attributed a different final quip to him, saying his last words were about regretting a switch from scotch to martinis. But Bacall's account is the one that holds up. His real last words were not a movie line. They were a husband saying goodbye to his wife, using the same word, kid, that had been part of their private language for years. Bogart's ashes are interred here at Westwood Village Memorial Park, and his grave remains one of the most visited spots in this small but extraordinary cemetery. From one beloved figure to another, let us take a detour to a small city in western New York State, Jamestown. This is the hometown and the final resting place of Lucille Ball. Lucy is buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Jamestown, not far from where she was born in 1911. Her original burial was at Forest Lawn in Hollywood Hills, but in 2002, at her family's request, her remains were moved back home to Jamestown, where a large memorial now marks her grave. You do not need to be told who Lucille Ball was. I Love Lucy, which ran from 1951 to 1957, was not just a television show. It was a phenomenon that essentially invented the modern sitcom. At its peak, more than 60 million Americans tuned in, at a time when the entire population was about 160 million. The episode in which Lucy gave birth to little Ricky drew more viewers than Eisenhower's inauguration the next day. Ball's physical comedy was extraordinary. She could take a pratfall with the skill of a trained stuntwoman and deliver a facial expression that communicated more than most actresses could manage with a whole page of dialogue. She fought the network to cast her real-life husband, Desi Arnaz, as her on-screen spouse at a time when a Cuban-American leading man was considered a commercial risk. CBS executives thought no one would believe a fiery redhead from New York could be married to a Cuban bandleader. Ball told them it was her show and Arnaz was her husband, and that was the end of the discussion. Together, they created Desilu Productions, which became one of the most powerful independent studios in Hollywood, eventually producing Mission, Impossible, and Star Trek. Ball was not just a comedian. She was a pioneering businesswoman and studio executive at a time when women held almost no power behind the camera. Ball suffered a ruptured aorta on April 18, 1989, and underwent emergency open-heart surgery at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. For a few days, it seemed as though she might recover. But on April 26th, she suffered a second cardiac event and died. She was 77. In her final hours, when someone asked her if there was anything she wanted, Ball's last words were, "My Florida water." She was not asking for a drink. Florida Water is a light citrus-scented cologne that Ball had loved and worn for years, a fragrance with roots in the 19th century that has a devoted following to this day. Even at the very end, she wanted the familiar comfort of her favorite scent. There is something quietly moving about that. Not a grand statement, not a farewell, but a small personal request that tells you everything about who she was when the cameras were off. Let us make a longer journey now, up the California coast and inland to the town of Palo Alto. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, is buried at Alta Mesa Memorial Park, a quiet cemetery in a residential neighborhood. There is no grand monument. His grave is not publicly marked, and the location is not widely promoted. Jobs valued privacy in life and, to the extent possible, got it in death. Jobs changed the way we live. The Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. Each of these products reshaped entire industries and rewired the habits of billions of people. He was adopted as an infant, grew up in what is now Silicon Valley, dropped out of Reed College, and co-founded Apple in his parents' garage in 1976 with Steve Wozniak. He was ousted from his own company in 1985 after a boardroom power struggle, an experience he later called the best thing that ever happened to him. He returned in 1997 and presided over one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in business history, taking Apple from the brink of bankruptcy to the most valuable company on earth. Along the way, he also bought a little computer graphics division from Lucasfilm and turned it into Pixar, which revolutionized animated filmmaking with Toy Story and its successors. But in 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer called a neuroendocrine tumor. He fought it for 8 years with a combination of surgery, a liver transplant, experimental treatments, and sheer willpower. He continued to work through much of his illness, unveiling the iPad in 2010 while already visibly thin. Jobs died at home on October 5, 2011, surrounded by his family. He was 56. His sister, the novelist Mona Simpson, later delivered a eulogy at his memorial service in which she described his final moments. According to Simpson, Jobs looked at his sister Patty, then at his children, then at his wife Laureen, and then looked past them all, as if seeing something beyond the room. His last words, repeated 3 times, were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." No one knows what Steve Jobs saw or thought he saw in those final seconds. But from a man who spent his life creating things that made people gasp with wonder, those last words feel strangely fitting. Simpson said it was as if he were on a journey, and the destination was beautiful. Speaking of unforgettable exits, let us return to Southern California, to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. This is one of the great Catholic cemeteries of Los Angeles, and among its residents you will find the man whose voice defined Christmas for an entire century, Bing Crosby. Crosby's recording of White Christmas remains the best-selling single of all time, with estimated sales north of 50 million copies. That one song alone would be enough to secure his legacy, but Crosby's career was staggeringly vast. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Going My Way in 1944, playing a warm-hearted parish priest, and received a second nomination the following year for the sequel, The Bells of St. Mary Possess. His mellow baritone and effortless charm made him the biggest entertainment star of the 1930s and 1940s, and for a long stretch, the most admired man in America, ahead of presidents and popes. He was a radio pioneer, a hit-making machine who charted more #1 singles than anyone until the Beatles came along, and a businessman shrewd enough to invest early in television technology and the frozen orange juice industry. Crosby was also an avid golfer, and good enough to have been inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame. The Bing Crosby National Pro-Am at Pebble Beach, now known as the Atant Pro-Am, remains one of the most famous celebrity golf tournaments in the world. On October 14, 1977, at the age of 74, Crosby was in Spain playing around at the La Moraleja Golf Club near Madrid. He played all 18 holes, shot a respectable 85, and won the match against his Spanish hosts. As he and his companions walked off the 18th green toward the clubhouse, Crosby turned to them with a satisfied grin and said, "That was a great game of golf, fellas." He collapsed about 20 yards from the clubhouse door. A massive heart attack took him almost instantly. One of his playing partners later said they thought he had simply slipped because he had shown no sign of fatigue and had been happy and singing his way around the course. Crosby's body was returned to California, and after a private funeral mass, he was laid to rest here at Holy Cross Cemetery. If you had to write a final scene for Bing Crosby, you could not do much better than a winning round of golf, a happy remark, and a sudden, painless departure with the Spanish sunset at his back. From the grounds of Holy Cross, let us make a stop that requires not a physical journey, but a spiritual one. We are visiting the legacy of the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock directed more than 50 feature films over 6 decades, and the list of his masterpieces is almost absurd in its richness. Psycho, Rear Window, Vertigo, North by Northwest, The Birds, Notorious, Strangers on a Train. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Director 5 times and never won, one of the great oversights in Oscar history. The Academy finally gave him the Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award in 1968, and his acceptance speech was one of the shortest on record. "Thank you." That was it. 5 letters, no elaboration. It was the most Hitchcock acceptance speech imaginable. His plump silhouette and deadpan delivery made him one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment, thanks in large part to his television series Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which ran for a decade and introduced him to a massive audience who might never have set foot in an art house cinema. His cameo appearances in his own films became a beloved tradition. Audiences would watch for the moment he appeared, usually in the first few minutes so that viewers would stop looking for him and pay attention to the story. Hitchcock died on April 29, 1980, at the age of 80, from kidney failure complicated by other ailments. He had been in declining health for several years and had been knighted by Queen Elizabeth just 4 months before his death. The words he reportedly spoke near the end are pure Hitchcock. He said, "One never knows the ending. One has to die to know exactly what happens after death. Although Catholics have their hopes, that is the man who spent his entire career keeping audiences in suspense, musing about the one mystery that no spoiler could ruin." Hitchcock was cremated, and his ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean. He does not have a traditional grave you can visit, but no tour of famous last words would be complete without the master of suspense getting the last word on the ultimate plot twist. Let us move on now to a grave that draws visitors from all over the world. We are heading to Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, a neighborhood of Newport Beach, California. The cemetery sits on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and tucked into its green rolling grounds is the final resting place of John Wayne. Wayne was the biggest movie star in the world for the better part of 3 decades. From Stagecoach in 1939, the John Ford Western that made him a star overnight, to The Shootist in 1976, his last film, he appeared in more than 170 films, the vast majority of them westerns and war pictures. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for True Grit in 1969, playing the one-eyed, hard-drinking Marshal Rooster Cogburn, a role that poked fun at his own mythology, and one he clearly relished. Off-screen, he was a larger-than-life figure, 6'4", broad-shouldered, outspoken in his politics, and utterly devoted to the idea of the rugged American individual. He was also, by many accounts, a warmer and more generous man in private than his tough guy image might suggest. He was married 3 times, had 7 children, and was fiercely protective of his family. Wayne was first diagnosed with lung cancer in 1964 and had a lung removed. He made a public statement about the surgery, urging people to get checkups and return to making movies. But in the late 1970s, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and this time the disease was not going to let him walk away. His health declined rapidly, and his family gathered around him in his final days at UCLA Medical Center. His daughter Aissa sat by his bedside, holding his hand. She asked him if he knew who she was. His response was as direct and tender as any line he ever delivered on screen. He said, "Of course I know who you are. You're my girl. I love you." Wayne died on June 11, 1979, at the age of 72. For years after his burial, his grave was left unmarked, out of concern that it might be vandalized. Today it bears a bronze plaque. Wayne was not a man who needed a grand monument. The words he left behind were enough. Now let us head back into Los Angeles proper, to the Eden Memorial Park in the San Fernando Valley. This is the final resting place of one of the sharpest wits in the history of American entertainment, Groucho Marx. Groucho was the wisecracking heart of the Marx Brothers, the comedy troupe that tore through vaudeville, Broadway, and Hollywood with a brand of anarchic humor that has never been duplicated. There were 5 Marx Brothers originally: Groucho, Harpo, Chico, Gummo, and Zeppo, though the act is best remembered as a trio. Films like Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera are still studied in comedy classes and still get genuine laughs from audiences nearly a century after they were made. Their brand of comedy, rapid-fire wordplay, absurd physical gags, and a gleeful disregard for plot, dignity, and common sense, influenced everyone from Mel Brooks to the writers of Airplane. Later, Groucho reinvented himself as the host of the quiz show You Bet Your Life, which ran for 11 years on NBC. His ad-libbed interactions with contestants were often funnier than anything that had been scripted for him, and the show introduced him to a new generation of fans who knew nothing about vaudeville. Groucho's wit was legendary and inexhaustible. He once said, "I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member," a line that Woody Allen later called the greatest joke ever told. He also said, "Outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside of a dog, it's too dark to read." Groucho was hospitalized at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in the summer of 1977 with pneumonia. He lingered for weeks. On August 19th, at the age of 86, he died, just 3 days after Elvis Presley, which meant that his passing received far less attention than it might otherwise have. His last words have been reported in 2 versions, and both sound exactly like something Groucho Marx would say. Some sources claim he said, "Die, my dear? Why, that's the last thing I'll do." Others say he simply looked around the hospital room and muttered, "This is no way to live." Either way, the old man went out with a line. Groucho is buried at Eden Memorial Park under a simple flat marker. His grave reportedly bears 3 words that are perfectly Groucho: Groucho Marx, entertainer. From the comic genius of Groucho Marx, let us shift to a very different kind of genius, one that belonged to a voice like no other. We are going now to Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City near Palm Springs, California, where Frank Sinatra rests. Sinatra was, by almost any measure, the most important popular singer of the 20th century. His phrasing, his emotional depth, his ability to inhabit a lyric, these things did not just influence other singers, they changed what singing could be. He came up through the big band era, singing with Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, and by the early 1940s he had become the first modern pop idol. Teenage girls screamed and fainted at his concerts decades before the Beatles made such behavior fashionable. Then his career nearly died. His voice faltered, his records stopped selling, and his personal life, including a turbulent marriage to Ava Gardner, was a mess. Hollywood had all but written him off when he fought for and won the role of Private Maggio in From Here to Eternity, taking a massive pay cut to get it. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor and launched one of the greatest comebacks in entertainment history. The albums that followed in the 1950s, In the Wee Small Hours, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Come Fly With Me, are among the finest vocal recordings ever made. In the 1960s, he led the Rat Pack alongside Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., turning Las Vegas into the entertainment capital of the world. He was also a complicated, sometimes volatile man who inspired fierce loyalty and fierce resentment in roughly equal measure. He could be extraordinarily generous to friends and cruel to people who crossed him. Sinatra suffered a heart attack on May 14, 1998, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. His wife, Barbara, was at his side. According to his longtime friend Tony Opedisano, Sinatra's last words were, "I'm losing it." Opedisano later said that Sinatra had been resigned to the fact that he had given it his best, but was not going to pull through. The chairman of the board, who had spent his entire career commanding rooms and stages, knew when the curtain was falling. He was 82. He was laid to rest at Desert Memorial Park, where visitors still leave small tributes, coins, flowers, bottles of Jack Daniels, at his grave. From the crooner's desert resting place, let us travel all the way across the country to a very different landscape, the rural outskirts of Beach Island, South Carolina. This is where you will find the final resting place of James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business, and arguably the single most influential figure in the development of funk, hip-hop, and modern dance music. James Brown's career was extraordinary by any standard. He grew up in crushing poverty in Augusta, Georgia, was raised largely by aunts in a house that doubled as a brothel, and spent time in juvenile detention as a teenager. Music saved him. From Please, Please, Please in 1956, a song so raw and emotional that his record label initially refused to release it, to I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in the mid-1960s to Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. In 1968, Brown was not just making music. He was shaping the sound and the politics of an era. His footwork was so precise and so electrifying that it directly influenced Michael Jackson and Prince, among countless others. When Jackson performed the moonwalk, he was building on moves he had learned from watching James Brown on television as a boy. Brown's band was the tightest in the business, and he ran it with the discipline of a drill sergeant, reportedly fining musicians for missed notes or wrinkled uniforms. Brown was admitted to an Atlanta hospital on December 23, 2006, showing signs of congestive heart failure and pneumonia. Even from his hospital bed, he was talking about his upcoming New Year's Eve show at BB King Blues Club in New York. The hardest working man in show business did not take days off. But on Christmas morning, Brown's longtime manager and friend Charles Bobbitt was at his bedside when Brown told him quietly, "I'm going away tonight." Bobbitt did not want to believe it. A short time later, Brown sighed 3 times, closed his eyes, and was gone. He was 73. His body was eventually placed in a crypt on the property of his daughter, Deanna Brown Thomas in Beach Island, after a series of elaborate public memorials in New York and Augusta, Georgia, that were as large and exuberant as the man himself. At the Apollo Theater Memorial, Al Sharpton led mourners in a final chant, "James Brown, Soul Brother Number 1. After all that soul and all that fire, let us visit someone whose warmth was of an entirely different kind." We turn our attention now to a woman who made America smile for the better part of a century. Betty White's ashes were scattered privately at sea in accordance with her wishes, so there is no grave to visit. But her last word is too significant to leave out of our journey tonight. Betty White's career in television spanned more than 70 years, longer than any other performer in the medium's history. She was a pioneer on early live television in Los Angeles in the late 1940s and 1950s, at a time when the industry was still figuring out what television could be. She hosted her own variety show in 1954 and won her first Emmy Award. She became a household name first as the man-hungry, passive-aggressive Sue Ann Nivens on The Mary Tyler Moore Show in the 1970s, a role that gleefully subverted her wholesome image, and then as the sweetly naive Rose Nyland on The Golden Girls in the 1980s. She won 5 Emmy Awards in total and received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Screen Actors Guild. In her 90s, she became a cultural phenomenon all over again. A Facebook campaign to have her host Saturday Night Live gathered over 500,000 supporters, and she did host, becoming the oldest person to do so. She was beloved by a new generation who discovered her sharp wit and playful spirit. White died on December 31st, 2021, just 17 days before her 100th birthday. Her passing felt like a personal loss to millions. But perhaps the most touching detail came from her assistant, who later told Carol Burnett that the very last word Betty White spoke was Alan. Alan Ludden, the beloved game show host of Password, had been White's husband from 1963 until his death from stomach cancer in 1981, more than 40 years before she followed him. In her final breath, Betty White was calling for the love of her life. She had waited 4 decades, and at the very end, she went to meet him. Speaking of loves that outlasted a lifetime, let us travel now to the town of Colma, just south of San Francisco. Colma is an unusual place, a town of roughly 2,000 living residents and well over 1 million dead ones. The result of San Francisco banning new burials within its city limits back in 1900. Among the quiet rows of Holy Cross Cemetery here, you will find the grave of Joe DiMaggio. DiMaggio was one of the finest baseball players who ever lived. His 56-game hitting streak in 1941 remains one of the most unbreakable records in sports, a feat so improbable that mathematicians have studied it and concluded it probably should not have happened at all. He played his entire 13-year career with the New York Yankees, winning 9 World Series championships and 3 American League Most Valuable Player awards. He was the son of a Sicilian fisherman in San Francisco, and he played the game with an elegance and quiet intensity that made the difficult look effortless. Ted Williams, his great rival, said DiMaggio was the best all-around player he ever saw. He missed 3 seasons in his prime to serve in the Army during World War II and never complained about it. Simon and Garfunkel immortalized him in Mrs. Robinson when they sang, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?" A lyric Paul Simon later said was about the loss of American heroes, not about DiMaggio specifically. But for all his achievements on the diamond, DiMaggio may be remembered just as much for the woman he loved and lost. He married Marilyn Monroe in January 1954. The marriage lasted barely 9 months. The pressures of 2 enormous egos and 2 incompatible lifestyles were too much. But DiMaggio never got over her. After their divorce, they reconciled several times, speaking frequently by phone, and friends said they were planning to remarry when Monroe died in August 1962. DiMaggio was shattered. He took charge of her funeral arrangements, personally barring most of Hollywood from attending. He blamed the entertainment industry and the Kennedys for her death, and he never spoke publicly about her again. For the next 20 years, he had red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week. DiMaggio died of lung cancer on March 8, 1999, at the age of 84. According to his lawyer and close friend Morris Engelberg, who was at his bedside, DiMaggio's last words were, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." It should be noted that DiMaggio's brother Dominic, who was also present, later disputed whether those were his exact words. But the devotion behind the sentiment was never in question. For 37 years, Joe DiMaggio carried the ghost of Marilyn Monroe with him. In death, he hoped to find her again. And since we have just spoken her name, let us go now to the place where Marilyn herself rests. We head back to Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, where Marilyn Monroe has been interred since August 8, 1962. Her crypt, number 24 in the Corridor of Memories, is one of the most visited graves in the world. Visitors leave lipstick kisses, flowers, and letters there to this day. Monroe was much more than the breathy blonde bombshell of popular imagination. She was a serious student of acting who studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, sitting alongside Marlon Brando and James Dean. She delivered genuinely fine performances in Bus Stop, Some Like It Hot, which many critics consider the greatest comedy ever made, and The Misfits, her final completed film, written for her by Arthur Miller. She was also a voracious reader and an unexpectedly sharp conversationalist who could hold her own with intellectuals and heads of state alike. Arthur Miller, the playwright she married in 1956, was one of the great intellectuals of his era, and he did not marry her for her looks alone. But Monroe was also a deeply troubled woman who struggled with depression, addiction, and a childhood marked by abandonment and foster care. Her mother was institutionalized with mental illness, and Marilyn spent her earliest years bouncing between foster homes and an orphanage. She never knew her father. The vulnerability that made her so magnetic on screen was not an act. On the evening of August 4, 1962, Monroe was at her home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. She made a phone call to actor Peter Lawford, who was the brother-in-law of President John F. Kennedy. According to Lawford's account, Monroe's voice was slurred and fading. Her last words to him were, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." She was found dead the next morning. The official cause was an overdose of barbiturates. She was 36 years old. DiMaggio arranged the funeral, kept the Hollywood establishment away, and began his 20-year vigil of roses. Decades later, on his own deathbed, he was still saying her name. From one legend to another, let us journey now to a very different part of the world. Bob Marley, the man who brought reggae to the globe, is buried at 9 Mile in the parish of St. Anne, Jamaica, the same rural village where he was born. His mausoleum there has become a pilgrimage site for fans from every continent. Marley's impact on world music and culture is almost impossible to overstate. Songs like No Woman, No Cry, Redemption Song, One Love, and Get Up, Stand Up transcended genre and geography and became anthems for liberation movements from South Africa to Eastern Europe. He was a Rastafarian prophet, a political figure in Jamaica so important that an attempt was made on his life in 1976. He was shot in the arm and chest 2 days before a concert aimed at easing political tensions in Kingston. He performed at the concert anyway, telling a reporter afterward that the people who were trying to make the world worse never took a day off, and neither should he. His album Exodus was named by Time magazine as the greatest album of the 20th century. In 1977, Marley was diagnosed with melanoma under the nail of his right big toe. Doctors recommended amputation, but he refused on religious grounds. Rastafarian belief holds the body sacred and whole. By 1980, the cancer had spread to his brain, lungs, and other organs. He collapsed while jogging in Central Park during a visit to New York and was taken to the hospital. He sought experimental treatment in Germany from a controversial physician, but the disease was too far advanced. On May 11, 1981, Marley died in a Miami hospital on his way home to Jamaica. He was 36. Before he died, Marley spoke his final words to his son, Ziggy. They were simple and profound. Money can't buy life. From a man who had grown up in the poverty of Trenchtown and gone on to become one of the most famous people on earth, those 5 words carry the weight of an entire philosophy. They are perhaps the most quoted last words of the 20th century. Let us turn now to someone who had quite a different philosophy about life and its pleasures. We are going to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, one of the grandest cemeteries in the United States. It sprawls across 300 acres of manicured hills and is the resting place of dozens of Hollywood legends. Among them is Errol Flynn. Flynn was the greatest swashbuckler the movies ever produced. In films like Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, and The Seahawk, he swung from ropes, dueled with swords, and romanced leading ladies with a grin so dazzling it ought to have been insured. He was the definition of old Hollywood glamour, handsome, dashing, and completely irresistible. Off-screen, he was just as colorful. He was born in Hobart, Tasmania, in 1909, and before he became a movie star, he had worked as a tobacco planter in New Guinea, a diamond smuggler, a shipping clerk, and a constable. He was also, by his own cheerful admission, a dedicated hedonist. He drank prodigiously, pursued women relentlessly, and lived as though tomorrow were somebody else's problem. In 1943, he was tried on charges of statutory rape involving 2 teenage girls. He was acquitted, but the trial made him even more notorious. The phrase, "in like Flynn," entered the English language as a testament to his reputation. What tends to get lost in all the stories about his lifestyle is that Flynn could actually act. His performance in the 1942 war film Gentleman Jim, in which he played the boxer James J. Corbett, showed a range that surprised critics. He was not just a pretty face with a sword, he was a genuinely talented screen presence who could carry drama as well as adventure. Flynn died of a heart attack on October 14, 1959, in Vancouver, Canada. He was only 50 years old, though the autopsy reportedly revealed the body of a much older man, ravaged by years of hard living. According to various accounts, his last words were, "I've had a hell of a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed every minute of it." That was Errol Flynn in a sentence. He is buried here at Forest Lawn in Glendale, where many of his fellow stars from the Golden Age also rest. One imagines his neighbors are somewhat less rowdy. Staying in the realm of music, let us travel east to Hendersonville, Tennessee, just a short drive north of Nashville. Hendersonville Memory Gardens is a quiet, unassuming cemetery, the kind of place you might drive past without a second glance. But if you walk in, you will find two graves side by side that represent one of the greatest love stories in the history of country music. This is where Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash are buried. Johnny Cash was the man in black. He was the voice of Folsom Prison Blues, Ring of Fire, I Walk the Line, and A Boy Named Sue. He sold more than 90 million records worldwide. He won 13 Grammy Awards. He performed live at Folsom Prison in San Quentin, making albums that became landmarks of American music. Despite the outlaw image, Cash never actually served time in prison, though he did spend a few nights in jail on minor charges, mostly drug-related. He battled addiction for decades, and it was June Carter who helped pull him back from the edge more times than anyone could count. In the 1990s, when Nashville had largely forgotten him, Cash reinvented himself through his collaboration with producer Rick Rubin. The American Recording Series stripped his music down to the essentials, just Cash, his voice, and a guitar, and introduced him to a new generation of fans. His cover of Nine Inch Nails' Hurt, released as a music video in 2003, is widely considered one of the greatest music videos ever made. The sight of the aging, ailing Cash surrounded by the relics of his career, singing about a lifetime of pain, moved millions of people to tears. Cash married June Carter in 1968, after she reportedly told him she would marry him if he got clean. They performed together, raised a family together, and remained inseparable for 35 years. Together they won a Grammy for Jackson and became country music's most beloved couple. June died on May 15, 2003, following complications from heart surgery. She was 73. Johnny was devastated beyond consolation. He threw himself into recording music, completing dozens of songs in the weeks after her death, as if the music were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. But his own health, ravaged by years of diabetes and autonomic neuropathy, was failing rapidly. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, less than 4 months after June. He was 71. His reported last words, according to some sources close to the family, were a reference to the opening line of his most famous song, "I hear the train a-comin'." Whether those were his exact final words, or a family embellishment that grew into legend, is a matter of some debate. But the sentiment is right. The man who heard that lonesome whistle his whole life finally answered it. He and June lie side by side in Hendersonville, together again, and one hopes, for good. From the heartland of country music, let us take a sharp turn into the world of Broadway and old Hollywood scandal. We are going now to St. Paul's Churchyard in Chestertown, Maryland, where the great Tallulah Bankhead is buried. Bankhead was one of the most outrageous personalities of the 20th century, an actress, a wit, and a force of nature who lived her life at full volume and never apologized for any of it. She was born into Alabama political royalty. Her father was Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, and her uncle was a United States Senator. She abandoned the genteel Southern life for the stage and became a sensation in London's West End in the 1920s before conquering Broadway. She delivered a powerful performance as the journalist in Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat in 1944, earning the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Actress, and her stage work in The Little Foxes and The Skin of Our Teeth cemented her as one of the great theatrical talents of her generation. She won the Tony Award for Best Actress in a Play in 1956 and was a larger-than-life presence wherever she went. She was famous for calling everyone darling for her raspy voice, the product of a lifelong cigarette habit, for her fearless disregard of convention, and for stories that were so colorful they could not be repeated in polite company. She once said, "I'm as pure as the driven slush." Dorothy Parker observed that Bankhead was always skating on thin ice, and the audience was always there, hoping she would fall through. Bankhead died on December 12, 1968, at the age of 66, from pneumonia complicated by emphysema. She had been ill for some time and was fading in and out of consciousness in her final hours at St. Luke's Hospital in New York. According to accounts from those present, her last words were, "Codeine, bourbon." She knew what she wanted, and she was not interested in discussion. That is Tallulah Bankhead in 2 words: direct, unapologetic, and completely certain of her preferences. She is buried at St. Paul's Churchyard in a quiet corner of the Maryland Eastern Shore. If you visit, you might raise a glass of bourbon in her honor, she would have insisted. From one sharp-tongued personality to another, let us visit Westwood Village Memorial Park again, where so many famous people rest in close quarters. Among them is Truman Capote, one of the most brilliant and self-destructive writers in American history. Capote burst onto the literary scene in 1948 with Other Voices, Other Rooms, published when he was just 23. The novel's dust jacket featured a provocative photograph of the young author reclining on a sofa with a come-hither stare that scandalized the literary establishment and made him instantly famous. He went on to write Breakfast at Tiffany's, the novella that became an iconic Audrey Hepburn film, and, most famously, In Cold Blood, the 1966 true crime masterpiece that essentially invented a genre. He spent 6 years researching the murder of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas, and the result was a work of non-fiction written with the narrative tension of a thriller. It remains one of the best-selling true crime books ever published. Capote was also a fixture of New York high society, a gossip, a provocateur, and a regular on television talk shows where his high-pitched voice and cutting observations made him an unlikely celebrity. His black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel in 1966 was called the Party of the Century. But Capote's later years were marked by alcoholism and drug dependency that consumed his talent. He spent decades promising a grand novel called Answered Prayers, but when excerpts appeared in Esquire magazine in the mid-1970s, the thinly veiled portraits of his society friends caused a scandal that left him socially exiled. The women he called his swans, women like Babe Paley, Slim Keith, and Lee Radziwill, cut him dead. He never finished the book and never recovered from the betrayal of his own betrayal. Capote died on August 25, 1984, at the age of 59, of liver disease complicated by multiple drug intoxication at the Bel Air home of his friend Joanne Carson, the ex-wife of Johnny Carson. According to those who were present, in his final hours, Capote was heard mumbling, "Mama, mama, mama." The most sophisticated man in New York, the toast of cafe society, the man who had dined with swans and danced with presidents, spent his last moments calling for his mother, a woman named Lily May who had abandoned him as a child, leaving him with elderly relatives in Monroeville, Alabama. He spent his entire life trying to earn the love she never gave him, and at the end, she was all he wanted. Capote's ashes were originally placed at Westwood Village Memorial Park, though portions were later moved amid a custody dispute. Let us shift gears entirely now and visit a man who brought laughter to the world with the lightest of touches. We are heading to Forest Lawn in Hollywood Hills, where Stan Laurel is buried. Laurel, the thin, bewildered half of Laurel and Hardy, was one of the founding geniuses of screen comedy. Born Arthur Stanley Jefferson in Ulverston, England in 1890, he came to America as a young man and worked his way up through vaudeville. Together with the rotund, long-suffering Oliver Hardy, he made more than 100 films between the 1920s and the 1950s. Their physical comedy, the piano hauled up an endless flight of stairs in The Music Box, which won the Academy Award for Best Live-Action Short Film, The Car Crushed Flat, the gentle bumbling that escalated into glorious chaos, influenced every comedian who came after them, from Jerry Lewis to Jim Carrey to Monty Python. What set them apart from other comedy teams was the tenderness between them. Laurel and Hardy were not adversaries. They were friends who happened to be idiots, and the affection between them was real both on-screen and off. What many people do not know is that Laurel was the creative force behind the team. He wrote most of their material, directed several of their films uncredited, and spent hours in the editing room perfecting the timing of each gag. Hardy was content to arrive on set, deliver his performance brilliantly, and go play golf. Laurel was the worrier, the perfectionist, the one who could not stop tinkering. Laurel continued writing comedy material until the very end of his life, scribbling ideas for sketches that would never be performed. He died on February 23, 1965, at the age of 74, from a heart attack at his apartment in Santa Monica. Just minutes before his death, he told his nurse, "I'd rather be skiing than doing this." When the nurse asked if he was a skier, Laurel replied, "No, but I'd rather be doing that than this." It was a perfect comedy bit, delivered with flawless timing from a deathbed. Stan Laurel went out the way he had lived, with a laugh. Dick Van Dyke, who visited Laurel regularly in his later years, later said that Laurel was one of the funniest and kindest men he had ever known. From gentle laughter to something altogether more intense, let us travel to Ketchum, Idaho. This small town in the mountains of central Idaho, surrounded by some of the most beautiful country in America, is the final resting place of one of the towering figures of American literature, Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway needs no introduction to this audience. The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea. These books defined a style of writing so spare and powerful that it changed English prose forever. Before Hemingway, much American literary writing was ornate and elaborate. After him, clarity was king. He stripped the language down to its bones and found that the bones were strong enough to hold anything: love, war, death, the sea. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1953 for The Old Man and the Sea and the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. He was also a war correspondent who waded ashore on D-Day at Omaha Beach, a big game hunter who went on safari in Africa, a deep-sea fisherman who battled marlins off the coast of Cuba, and a man who cultivated a public image of rugged masculinity that became as famous as his writing. He lived in Paris with the Lost Generation, drank with Fitzgerald, argued with Gertrude Stein, and ran with the bulls in Pamplona. But behind that image, Hemingway suffered from severe depression that ran in his family. His father, a brother, a sister, and a granddaughter all took their own lives. His mental health deteriorated sharply in his final years, likely exacerbated by decades of heavy drinking and the lingering effects of multiple injuries and concussions, including 2 plane crashes in Africa in 1954. He underwent electroconvulsive therapy at the Mayo Clinic, and he told friends it had destroyed his memory and, with it, his ability to write. For a man who defined himself through his work, the loss was unbearable. On the evening of July 1, 1961, at his home in Ketchum, Hemingway told his wife, Mary, "Good night, my kitten." The next morning, he ended his own life with a shotgun. He was 61. He is buried at the Ketchum Cemetery, a simple, unpretentious spot that suits the plain style he championed in his writing. His grave is marked by a modest stone in a row of modest stones, surrounded by the mountains and streams he loved. It is one of the quietest, most peaceful resting places on our entire journey. From one towering American figure to another, let us go now to Atlanta, Georgia, to the grounds of the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is entombed alongside his wife, Coretta Scott King, in a crypt that sits on a reflecting pool on the grounds of the King Center. King was the leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, the man who stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, and told 250,000 people about his dream. He organized the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, which began when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. He led the march from Selma to Montgomery. He sat in a Birmingham jail and wrote a letter that became one of the foundational documents of the movement. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 at the age of 35. At that time, the youngest person ever to receive it. He preached nonviolence with a courage and eloquence that moved not just a nation, but the world. By 1968, King was expanding his mission beyond civil rights to address poverty and the Vietnam War. He had come to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers, black men who carried signs reading, "I am a man," whose struggle he saw as fundamentally linked to the larger fight for justice. The night before his death, he delivered a speech at the Mason Temple that has become one of his most famous. He spoke of having been to the mountaintop, of having seen the promised land. "I may not get there with you," he told the crowd, "but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." It was as if he sensed what was coming. On the evening of April 4th, he was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, preparing to go to dinner. He called down to musician Ben Branch, who was going to perform at an event that evening. King's last words were a simple musical request. "Ben, make sure you play 'Take My Hand, Precious Lord' in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." Moments later, a single rifle shot struck King. He was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital. He was 39 years old. Those last words, a request for a beautiful song, spoken in a moment of ordinary human warmth, have an almost unbearable poignancy when you know what came next. The man who changed America spent his last seconds thinking about music. The Lorraine Motel is now the National Civil Rights Museum, and King's tomb in Atlanta draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. After such gravity, let us return to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, one of the grandest cemeteries in the United States. The park sprawls across 300 acres of manicured hills, and its roster of famous residents reads like a history of American entertainment. Among them, in the Freedom Mausoleum, rests Spencer Tracy. Tracy was one of the finest screen actors who ever lived. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor 2 years in a row, for Captains Courageous in 1937, in which he played a Portuguese fisherman with such conviction that you forgot you were watching an Irish American from Milwaukee, and for Boys Town in 1938 as the real-life Father Flanagan. He was nominated a total of 9 times, a record that stood for decades. His screen presence was so natural that it looked like he was not acting at all. Humphrey Bogart once said of Tracy, "I learned more about acting from watching Tracy than in any other way." When a young actor once asked Tracy for the secret to great screen acting, he reportedly replied, "Know your lines and don't bump into the furniture." It was a joke, of course, but it also captured his philosophy perfectly. He made the hardest thing in the world, making a performance look effortless, seem easy. He was the other half of one of Hollywood's most famous partnerships, appearing in 9 films with Katharine Hepburn, including Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which was filmed in 1967 and became his final picture. Tracy's health was so fragile during the filming that Stanley Kramer, the director, had to arrange his insurance personally because no underwriter would cover the risk. Tracy's relationship with Hepburn was one of Hollywood's great open secrets. Though Tracy never divorced his wife, Louise, partly out of Catholic guilt and partly because he was devoted to their son John, who was deaf. His romance with Hepburn lasted more than 25 years. They never lived together publicly, and Hepburn, one of the most independent women in Hollywood, accepted the arrangement without complaint. On the night of June 10, 1967, just 17 days after they finished filming Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Tracy and Hepburn were together at his cottage on the estate of director George Cukor. At around 3 in the morning, Hepburn heard a noise in the kitchen. She found Tracy slumped in his chair. He had suffered a massive heart attack. He was 67. Tracy's last known words, spoken earlier that evening to Hepburn, were reportedly, "I love you, Kate." Whether these were his very last words or simply the last words Hepburn chose to share with the world is a matter of some debate, but the devotion between them was never in doubt. Tracy was laid to rest here at Forest Lawn in Glendale, in the Freedom Mausoleum. Staying right here at Forest Lawn in Glendale, let us walk to another section of this vast cemetery. Not far from Spencer Tracy, in the Freedom Mausoleum, you will also find the resting place of Nat King Cole. Cole possessed one of the warmest, most immediately recognizable voices in the history of recorded music. Unforgettable, Mona Lisa, The Christmas Song, Nature Boy. These recordings have become part of the American landscape, as familiar as the turning of the seasons. The Christmas song, with its opening line about chestnuts roasting on an open fire, has been played so many hundreds of millions of times during the holiday season that it is difficult to imagine December without it. What many people do not realize is that Cole started out not as a vocalist but as a jazz pianist of extraordinary skill. The King Cole Trio was one of the most popular small jazz groups of the 1940s, and Cole's piano work influenced a generation of musicians, including Ray Charles, who openly credited Cole as a major inspiration. It was only when a drunk patron at a Los Angeles nightclub demanded that he sing that Cole reluctantly began to use his voice. The rest is history. In 1956, Cole became the first African-American performer to host a nationally broadcast television variety show, The Nat King Cole Show on NBC. The show was critically praised but short-lived because national sponsors refused to back it, fearing backlash in the South. Cole's response was characteristically dignified and devastating. Madison Avenue is afraid of the dark. The failure of that show remains one of the great shames of early television. Cole was a heavy smoker who was diagnosed with lung cancer in late 1964. He died on February 15, 1965, at the age of 45. Far too young. According to his wife, Maria, one of the last things he said to her was, "I'm not afraid." It was a declaration of courage from a man who had shown it his entire life, breaking barriers, enduring racism with grace, and meeting the world with beauty. His daughter Natalie later recorded a duet with his voice, recreating Unforgettable as a father-daughter performance that touched millions of listeners. It won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year in 1992 and introduced a whole new generation to the magic of Nat King Cole's voice, a voice that sounds, even now, like it is singing just for you. Nearby in Glendale, still at Forest Lawn, rests yet another figure who shaped the imagination of the entire world. Walt Disney's ashes are interred here, in the Freedom Mausoleum, in a family plot that also holds his wife Lillian and other family members. Despite one of the most persistent urban legends in American culture, Walt Disney was not cryogenically frozen. He was cremated 2 days after his death, and his remains were interred here in a private ceremony. Disney hardly needs an introduction. Mickey Mouse, Snow White, Disneyland, Walt Disney World. These creations did not just build an entertainment empire. They reshaped childhood itself for generations of Americans and billions of people around the world. Disney won 22 competitive Academy Awards, more than any other individual in history, plus 4 honorary Oscars. He was a restless innovator who was never satisfied with what he had already accomplished. When people told him Disneyland was impossible, he built it. When they told him an animated feature film would never work, he made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and changed the history of cinema. He was not a great artist himself. Many of his animators were far more talented draftsmen, but he was perhaps the greatest creative visionary of the 20th century, a man who could see a finished product in his mind before the first sketch was drawn. Disney was diagnosed with lung cancer in the fall of 1966 and died on December 15th of that year at the age of 65. His last written words were not spoken, but scrawled on a note found on his desk after his death. The note, written in pencil, listed several items, apparently projects he wanted to discuss with colleagues. Among the names on that note was one that would go on to become a major movie star, Kurt Russell. Disney had recently cast the 15-year-old Russell in his first Disney film and clearly had plans for him. Russell himself was later brought to Disney's office and shown the note. He has said he still does not know exactly what Disney intended. Nobody ever will. But there is something haunting about a man dying with a to-do list on his desk. Projects to greenlight, actors to develop, ideas to pursue. Walt Disney left this world with work still to be done, which may be the most Walt Disney thing imaginable. The company he built is now one of the largest entertainment conglomerates on Earth, and it all began with a man drawing a mouse on a train. Let us stroll through a different section of Forest Lawn now. Also interred at this Glendale location is another figure from Hollywood's more colorful past, W.C. Fields. Fields was the great curmudgeon of American comedy, the bulbous-nosed, muttering misanthrope who made an art form out of disdain for children, dogs, and sobriety. He starred in classic comedies like It's a Gift, My Little Chickadee with Mae West, and The Bank Dick, and his persona, the perpetually irritated man trapped in a world of idiots, has been imitated but never equaled. Before Hollywood, Fields was one of the greatest jugglers in the world, a vaudeville headliner who perfected his routines with an obsessive dedication that belied his on-screen image of cheerful incompetence. He played the Palace Theater in New York and performed before European royalty. He ran away from home at age 11 after a fight with his father, and spent years living on the streets, honing his act and developing the suspicious, anti-authoritarian worldview that became his comic trademark. The streets taught him never to trust anyone, a lesson he carried into every performance and, by most accounts, into his personal life as well. Fields was also a surprisingly gifted writer, who penned many of his own screenplays under absurd pseudonyms like Mahatma Cain Jeeves and Otis Kribble-Koblis. He was deeply protective of his material and fought constantly with studio executives who wanted to soften his comedy. He trusted no one with his money either. Legend has it he maintained bank accounts in cities all over the world under assumed names, fearing that another depression might wipe him out. Whether every one of those accounts has been found is an open question. Fields had been in declining health for years, worn down by decades of truly heroic drinking. He died on Christmas Day, 1946, at the age of 66. There is an old joke that Fields, a committed atheist, was found reading the Bible on his deathbed, and, when asked why, replied, "I'm looking for loopholes." Whether that actually happened is debatable, but his verified last words are equally good. According to accounts from those who were present, he said, "God damn the whole friggin' world and everyone in it but you, Carlotta." Carlotta Monte was his longtime companion. Even at the end, Fields managed to combine profanity, tenderness, and misanthropy in a single sentence. He is interred at Forest Lawn in Glendale, where he presumably continues to despise everyone within a 3-plot radius, except Carlotta. From one unforgettable voice to another, let us make a short drive to Forest Lawn in Hollywood Hills, where another of the Golden Age's most formidable women rests. This is the grave of Bette Davis. Davis was a force of nature on screen, with those enormous expressive eyes and a willingness to play unsympathetic characters that set her apart from every other actress of her era. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress twice, for Dangerous in 1935 and Jezebel in 1938, and received a total of 10 nominations, a record that stood for decades. Her greatest films include All About Eve, in which she played the aging Broadway star Margot Channing with a bitter brilliance that defined a new kind of screen performance, and now Voyager, and of course, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, opposite her arch-rival, Joan Crawford. The feud between them was real, vicious, and endlessly entertaining to the public. Davis supposedly had a Coca-Cola vending machine installed on the set of Baby Jane just to irritate Crawford, whose late husband had been the chairman of Pepsi. Davis spent her later years traveling and giving lectures about her career. She was not the type to fade quietly. She placed a famous classified ad in Variety magazine that read, in part, "Mother of 3, 30 years experience as an actress in motion pictures. Mobile still, and target more than willing." She was battling breast cancer and the effects of a stroke when she died on October 6, 1989, at the American Hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France, at the age of 81. She had gone to the San Sebastian Film Festival in Spain shortly before and received a standing ovation. Among the last things she reportedly said was a statement that could serve as the title of her autobiography. "I'd like to be remembered as someone who was damn good at her job." She was. And she is. Davis is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. Let us continue our tour by traveling now to a destination that exists not on any cemetery map but in the waters of San Francisco Bay. Robin Williams was cremated and his ashes were scattered there, so there is no grave to visit. But his last words are too significant to leave behind. Williams was one of the most gifted performers of his generation, and perhaps of any generation. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for Good Will Hunting in 1997, delivering a performance of quiet power that proved he was as great a dramatic actor as he was a comedian. He starred in Dead Poets Society, Mrs. Doubtfire, Good Morning Vietnam, The Fisher King, and dozens of other films that ranged from heartwarming to harrowing. He was also unforgettable as the voice of the genie in Disney's Aladdin, a performance he largely improvised, giving the animators hours of material to choose from. On stage, his stand-up comedy was a force of nature. His mind worked so fast and ranged so widely that other comedians could only watch in awe and surrender. Jonathan Winters, himself one of the great improvisers, said Williams was the only comic who ever scared him. What people who met him always remarked on, even more than the comedy, was his kindness. He visited hospitals, called sick fans, and performed for troops overseas without fanfare or publicity. But Williams struggled for years with depression and addiction. He had been open about his battles with cocaine and alcohol earlier in his career, and in his later years he suffered from anxiety and insomnia that grew steadily worse. In his final months, he was experiencing a terrifying array of symptoms: paranoia, confusion, tremors, difficulty remembering his lines, that neither he nor his doctors fully understood. He was suffering from an undiagnosed form of Lewy body dementia, a degenerative brain disease that was systematically destroying his mind. His widow, Susan Schneider Williams, later described it as a terrorist inside her husband's brain. On the night of August 10, 2014, Williams said goodnight to Susan. According to her later account, his last words were, "Good night, my love." Then he went into another bedroom and he ended his own life. He was 63. The autopsy revealed the Lewy body dementia, and Susan has since become an advocate for awareness of the disease, explaining that it, not depression alone, was ravaging her husband's brain. Those last words, so gentle and loving, make the tragedy even harder to bear. He said goodnight as though he were simply going to sleep. Let us turn now to a figure of extraordinary glamour and extraordinary sadness. Our next stop takes us back to Forest Lawn in Glendale, to the Great Mausoleum, where Michael Jackson is interred in a private area called the Holly Terrace. Jackson was the biggest pop star in the history of music. That is not hyperbole. Thriller, released in 1982, became the best-selling album of all time, with estimated sales exceeding 66 million copies worldwide. It produced 7 hit singles, and the 14-minute music video for the title track, directed by John Landis, changed what music videos could be. Songs like Billie Jean, Beat It, and Thriller did not just top the charts. They broke down racial barriers on MTV, which had been reluctant to play videos by black artists until CBS Records threatened to pull all its artists from the channel if they did not air Billie Jean. His moonwalk, first performed on the Motown 25 television special in 1983, became the most imitated dance move on the planet. He won 13 Grammy Awards and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once as a member of the Jackson 5 and once as a solo artist. Before all of that, he had been a child star of extraordinary ability, fronting the Jackson 5 at the age of 10 with a vocal power and stage presence that made grown performers look amateurish by comparison. His journey from Gary, Indiana to the top of the world was one of the most remarkable in the history of entertainment, and one of the most troubling, given the childhood he sacrificed to get there. Jackson's final years were troubled. He was acquitted of child molestation charges in 2005, but the trial took a devastating toll on his health and public image. He moved to Bahrain and later to Ireland, living in a kind of exile. In 2009, he was preparing for a series of 50 comeback concerts at London's O2 Arena, shows titled "This Is It" that were supposed to be his grand return. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, was administering the powerful anesthetic propofol to help Jackson sleep, a practice that was both dangerous and deeply irregular. On June 25, 2009, Murray administered another dose. Jackson never woke up. He died at the age of 50. According to Murray's later testimony, Jackson's last words, spoken as the drug was being administered, were, "More milk." Milk was Jackson's private nickname for propofol because of its white, milky appearance. He was asking for the very substance that would kill him. Murray was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served roughly 2 years. From one extreme of fame to another, let us visit a man whose particular brand of comedy was as large as the man himself. We are going now to Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Cemetery in Miami, Florida, where Jackie Gleason is buried. Gleason was one of the most beloved figures in the history of American television. As Ralph Kramden on The Honeymooners, he created one of the great comedic characters of all time, the loud, blustering, endlessly scheming Brooklyn bus driver whose schemes always failed, but whose heart was always in the right place. "To the moon, Alice," became one of the most quoted lines on television. The show ran originally as a sketch on Gleason's variety show before getting its own legendary 39-episode season in 1955 and 1956, a run so perfect that it has never been off the air since. Every blue-collar sitcom that followed, from All in the Family to Roseanne to The King of Queens, owes something to what Gleason built with Ralph Kramden. Gleason was also a talented dramatic actor, earning an Academy Award nomination for his role as the pool shark Minnesota Fats in The Hustler in 1961, opposite Paul Newman. Newman later said that working with Gleason was like stepping into the ring with a heavyweight. The man simply commanded every scene he was in. And Gleason was a surprisingly successful musician. His mood music albums, with titles like Music for Lovers Only, sold millions of copies, even though Gleason himself could barely read music and conducted his orchestra largely through hand gestures and sheer personality. Off-camera, he was known as one of the great eaters and drinkers of his generation, a man who attacked a steak the way he attacked a comedy scene, with total commitment and no restraint. Gleason died on June 24, 1987, at the age of 71, from colon cancer and liver cancer at his home in Fort Lauderdale. According to accounts from his family, his last words were, "And away we go." Fans of The Jackie Gleason Show will recognize that phrase instantly. It was his signature catchphrase, the line he used to launch every show. At the very end, the Great One used it to launch himself into whatever comes next. Let us return to the world of classic Hollywood acting and visit Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles. This is the final resting place of John Barrymore, a man once called the greatest actor of his generation. Barrymore was the patriarch of Hollywood's most famous acting dynasty. Drew Barrymore is his granddaughter. In the 1920s, his Hamlet on Broadway was considered the definitive interpretation of the role, running for a then-record 101 performances. He was called the Great Profile for his strikingly handsome features, and he transitioned from stage to screen with effortless grace, starring in Grand Hotel, 20th Century, and dozens of other films. His performance in the dual role of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1920 was considered a masterpiece of physical transformation. He made the change between characters without heavy makeup, using only his body and facial expressions. He was also, by unanimous account, one of the most self-destructive alcoholics in the history of a profession that has never lacked for competition in that department. By the early 1940s, decades of drinking had devastated his health and his once extraordinary memory. He resorted to reading his lines from cue cards, and his late films are painful to watch for anyone who remembers his greatness. He became a tragic figure, parodying himself on radio shows for money to support his drinking, a living reminder of how completely genius can be drowned. Barrymore collapsed during a rehearsal for the Rudy Valley radio show on May 19, 1942, and died later that evening at the age of 60. His last words, according to those who were present, were a characteristically dramatic piece of defiance. "Die? I should say not, dear fellow. No Barrymore would allow such a conventional thing to happen to him." Whether he actually said this with such polish or the quote was cleaned up for posterity is a matter of some debate, but the spirit of it is pure Barrymore, theatrical, witty, and absolutely certain that the rules did not apply to him. He is buried at Calvary Cemetery, and the dynasty he founded continues to this day, 3 generations later. Let us now make a significant journey overseas to the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. At Coursier-sur-Vevey Cemetery in the small town of Vevey, you will find the grave of Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin was, quite simply, the most famous person in the world during the first half of the 20th century. The Little Tramp, that figure with the bowler hat, the cane, the baggy trousers, and the toothbrush mustache, was recognized in every country on Earth in an era before television and the internet. He was the first global celebrity, a man whose face was known in villages that had no electricity and in cities that had no theaters. Films like The Gold Rush, City Lights, Modern Times, and The Great Dictator are not just milestones of cinema. They are milestones of human expression. Chaplin could make you laugh until you wept, and then make you weep for real, sometimes in the same scene. He wrote, directed, produced, starred in, and composed the music for most of his major films. A level of creative control that was unprecedented and has rarely been matched. Chaplin left the United States in 1952 after being caught up in the political paranoia of the McCarthy era. He had never become an American citizen, and his leftist politics and unconventional personal life made him a target. He settled in Switzerland with his 4th wife, Una O'Neill, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill, who never forgave her for the marriage, and their children, and he never returned to live in America. He did come back once in 1972 to accept an honorary Academy Award. The standing ovation he received that night lasted 12 minutes, the longest in Oscar history. The man who had been chased out of America was welcomed back as a hero. Chaplin died on Christmas Day, 1977, at the age of 88. When a priest arrived to perform last rites, Chaplin was asked if he wished to commend his soul to God. His answer, according to accounts from those present, was, "Why not? After all, it belongs to him." Even at the end, the Little Tramp had something unexpected to say. Chaplin is buried in Coursier-sur-Vevey. In a bizarre postscript, his coffin was stolen from the cemetery in March 1978 by 2 men who attempted to ransom the body for the equivalent of about $600,000. Swiss police recovered the coffin 11 weeks later in a cornfield near the lake, and it was reburied under a layer of concrete to prevent any further disturbances. Even in death, Chaplin could not escape the plot twists. Let us return to the United States and to the world of popular music. We are going now to Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California, where the great Ray Charles is buried. Ray Charles was a genius, not just in the colloquial sense, but as his official title. They called him the Genius of Soul, and he earned it every day of his life. Blind since the age of 7 from glaucoma, orphaned by the age of 15, Charles merged gospel, blues, jazz, and country into something entirely new and electrifying. He played piano with a rocking, swaying intensity that made audiences feel the music in their bodies, and when he sang, his voice carried the full weight of the Black American experience. Joy, sorrow, defiance, and faith all wrapped together. I got a woman, Georgia on my mind, hit the road, Jack, I can't stop loving you. These recordings are cornerstones of American music. His 1962 album Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music was a radical act. A black man from the Deep South singing country songs at the height of the Civil Rights era, insisting that good music had no color line. It became one of the best-selling albums of the decade and changed the way Americans thought about genre. He won 17 Grammy Awards over his career and was one of the first inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. Charles also battled a heroin addiction for nearly 2 decades, an ordeal he conquered in the late 1960s after an arrest and the threat of prison forced him to get clean. He kicked the habit cold turkey and never used again, a feat of willpower that astonished those who knew how deeply the drug had its hooks in him. Charles died on June 10, 2004, at the age of 73 from liver disease at his home in Beverly Hills. In his final days, he was surrounded by family and, by all accounts, at peace with the life he had lived. According to those close to him, among his last words were a simple declaration: "I'm at peace with myself." It was a fitting valediction from a man who had overcome blindness, poverty, racism, and addiction to become one of the most important musicians in history. Charles is buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery, not far from another legend we will visit in just a moment. Our next stop takes us to a place of enormous historical gravity. We are going to Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, the most hallowed burial ground in the United States. Among the rows of white headstones and the monuments to the nation's fallen, there burns an eternal flame. This marks the grave of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. Kennedy was inaugurated on January 20, 1961, at the age of 43, the youngest elected president in American history, and the first Roman Catholic to hold the office. He had won one of the closest elections in history, edging Richard Nixon by fewer than 120,000 votes out of nearly 69 million cast, in a race that many believe was swung by the first-ever televised presidential debates. Kennedy looked calm, tanned, and confident on camera. Nixon looked tired and unshaven. It was the moment television became the dominant force in American politics. His presidency, though tragically brief, encompassed the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and back again. The creation of the Peace Corps, the acceleration of the space program, with his bold promise to land a man on the moon before the decade was out, and the early stages of the Civil Rights Revolution. His inaugural address, with its famous call to "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," remains one of the most quoted speeches in American history. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was riding in an open motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, with his wife, Jacqueline, and Texas Governor John Connally and his wife, Nellie. The crowds were large and enthusiastic. According to Nellie Connolly's account, she turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy's last words, spoken with that famous smile, were, "No, you certainly can't." Seconds later, shots rang out. Kennedy was struck and killed. He was 46 years old. The assassination remains one of the defining moments of the 20th century, a national trauma that everyone alive at the time can place exactly in their memory. Kennedy's grave at Arlington, with its eternal flame, has been visited by millions of people from every corner of the earth. Jacqueline Kennedy chose the flame as a symbol of her husband's enduring spirit. It has never gone out. From the solemnity of Arlington, let us make one more stop in the world of classic cinema. We are returning to Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, one of the most storied cemeteries in America. It sits in the shadow of the Paramount Pictures Water Tower, a fitting location for a burial ground filled with the people who built the movie industry. Among its many residents is the man who was once the most famous movie star on the planet, and for some, the most beautiful, Rudolph Valentino. Valentino was the original screen heartthrob. In the silent film era of the 1920s, his performances in The Sheik and Blood and Sand drove audiences into a frenzy that modern celebrity culture can barely match. Women fainted in theaters. Fan mail arrived by the truckload. He was the first true matinee idol, a dark-eyed Italian immigrant who was born Rodolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pier Filibert Guglielmi di Valentina d'Antonguela in Castellaneta, Italy, and came to America at the age of 18 with almost nothing. He worked as a busboy, a gardener, and a taxi dancer before the movies found him. Once on screen, he became the object of desire for millions of American women and the object of envy for millions of American men. Newspaper editorials denounced him as a threat to American masculinity, which only made the women love him more. He was, in many ways, the first modern celebrity. Famous not just for what he did, but for what he represented, for the feelings he stirred in people who had never met him. His sudden death at the age of 31 from a perforated ulcer and subsequent peritonitis caused mass hysteria. An estimated 100,000 people lined the streets of New York for his funeral in August 1926, and the scenes outside the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home were so chaotic that police had to use mounted officers to control the crowd. Reports of fans taking their own lives in grief circulated in the press, though the exact number has been debated by historians. Valentino's last words, spoken in delirium as his fever raged, were reportedly, "Don't pull down the blinds. I feel fine. I want the sunlight to greet me." He died on August 23, 1926. He is interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where for decades a mysterious Lady in Black visited his crypt every year on the anniversary of his death, leaving a single red rose. The tradition was eventually taken up by multiple women, and the identity of the original Lady in Black has never been definitively established. It is one of Hollywood's most enduring little mysteries. From the romantic ghosts of old Hollywood, let us head to the desert. We are going now to Palm Memorial Park in Las Vegas, Nevada, where the Great Red Fox is interred. Fox was one of the most influential comedians in American history. Long before he was famous on television, he was a legend on the nightclub circuit. His raunchy party records, sold under the counter and passed around like contraband in the 1950s and 1960s, pushed the boundaries of what stand-up comedy could say and paved the way for Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, and every comedian who ever worked blue. He recorded more than 50 comedy albums over his career, and they were essential listening in black households across America. Your parents hid them, your older brother found them, and everybody quoted them at barbecues. Then, in the 1970s, he became one of the biggest stars on television as Fred Sanford on Sanford and Son, playing a cantankerous junk dealer in Watts whose relationship with his son, played by Demond Wilson, gave the show its heart. The show ran for 6 seasons, drew an audience of tens of millions every Friday night, and Fox earned 3 Golden Globe nominations. His influence on black comedy and American comedy in general is immeasurable. Fox was also famously bad with money. The IRS seized his home and possessions in 1989 for unpaid taxes, reportedly nearly $3 million worth. And he was essentially starting over when he landed The Royal Family, his new CBS sitcom, in 1991. Fox died on October 11, 1991, at the age of 68, from a heart attack on the set of that very show, The Royal Family. Here is the chilling detail. Fox's character Fred Sanford on Sanford and Son was famous for faking heart attacks, clutching his chest and crying out to his late wife, "I'm coming, Elizabeth, this is the big one." When Fox collapsed on the set of The Royal Family, his castmates and crew initially thought he was doing the bit. They laughed. It took precious time before anyone realized this was not a performance. Fox reportedly told someone on set that he did not feel well just before he went down, but the cruel irony of the situation is universal. The man who made America laugh by pretending to have heart attacks died of one while people thought he was joking. Our journey is nearing its end now, and we have covered an extraordinary range of lives and deaths, from kings of rock and roll to godfathers of soul, from comedy legends to Hollywood royalty. But we have a few more stops to make. Let us go to Westwood Village Memorial Park one final time, where we will find the grave of Jack Lemmon, one of the most beloved actors in the history of American cinema. Lemmon won 2 Academy Awards. Best Supporting Actor for Mr. Roberts in 1955, in a role that almost went to someone else before Lemmon's screen test blew everyone away, and Best Actor for Save the Tiger in 1973, a film he fought to get made because he believed so deeply in its story of a businessman's moral collapse. He was nominated a total of 8 times. His range was remarkable. He could play broad comedy with perfect timing, then turn around and deliver a dramatic performance so raw and honest it left audiences shaken. The Apartment, directed by Billy Wilder, gave him perhaps his finest role, as the lonely insurance clerk C.C. Baxter caught between ambition and decency, and it won the Academy Award for Best Picture. His partnership with Walter Matthau in films like The Odd Couple, The Fortune Cookie, and Grumpy Old Men produced some of the most entertaining moments in movie history. They were as different as 2 men could be. Lemmon was meticulous and anxious, Matthau was shambling and deadpan, and together they were pure magic. Off-screen, they were genuine friends for nearly 4 decades, and when Matthau died in 2000, Lemmon was devastated. He delivered the eulogy and could barely get through it. Lemmon was also known in the industry for his kindness. He answered his own fan mail, He treated crew members with the same respect he gave directors and studio heads. Kevin Spacey, who worked with him on Glengarry Glen Ross, said Lemmon was the most generous actor he had ever been on a set with, always finding ways to make the other performers look good. Lemmon died on June 27, 2001, at the age of 76, from bladder and colon cancer, just a year after losing Matthau. In his final days, according to his son Chris, Lemmon's last words were characteristically humble and gracious. He said simply, "That was a great ride, wasn't it?" "It was indeed, Mr. Lemmon. It was indeed." Our next to last stop takes us back to Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California, where another extraordinary voice is at rest. This is the grave of Ella Fitzgerald, the First Lady of Song. Fitzgerald's voice was an instrument of extraordinary purity, warmth, and range. Over a career that spanned nearly 60 years, she recorded more than 200 albums, won 13 Grammy Awards, and sold more than 40 million records. Her interpretations of the Great American Songbook, the music of Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Duke Ellington, Rodgers, and Hart, remain the gold standard against which all other vocal performances are measured. Ira Gershwin himself said that he never fully understood how good his lyrics were until Ella Fitzgerald sang them. When she sang Summertime or Someone to Watch Over Me, she did not just perform the song. She seemed to discover something new inside it, something the composer might not have known was there. What many people do not know about Fitzgerald is that her career began almost by accident. In 1934, at the age of 17, she entered a talent contest at the Apollo Theater in Harlem planning to dance. But when she got on stage, she was so intimidated by the dance act that preceded her that she switched to singing on the spot. She won the contest and never looked back. Within a few years, she was the lead singer of Chick Webb's orchestra, and by the 1940s she was one of the most popular vocalists in America. When she scatted, she could trade phrases with the best jazz instrumentalists in the world and leave them shaking their heads in disbelief. Fitzgerald spent her final years in declining health, having lost both legs below the knee to complications from diabetes. She withdrew from public life and lived quietly in Beverly Hills. She died on June 15, 1996, at the age of 79. Her final public statement, released through a spokesman, included the words, "I just want to smell the air, the flowers, and be grateful." Those may not have been her literal last words in the clinical sense, but they capture the spirit of a woman who found beauty in everything and shared it with the world through her voice. She is buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery, where the simple fact of her name on a grave marker is enough to make you hear music. And now we come to our final stop. We end where endings feel heaviest and where last words echo longest. We have traveled across America tonight and even across the ocean, from Graceland to Arlington, from the hills of Hollywood to the mountains of Idaho, from a quiet churchyard in Maryland to a hillside in Jamaica. We have heard 40 stories of fame, talent, struggle, and loss. And now we come to our last. Patrick Swayze's ashes were scattered at his family ranch in New Mexico, a private and fitting farewell for a man who loved that land. There is no grave to visit. But his last words to his wife of 34 years, Lisa Niemi, deserve to close our journey. Swayze was the star of Dirty Dancing and Ghost, two films that became cultural touchstones of the 1980s and 1990s. The lift scene in Dirty Dancing, Jennifer Grey held above his head in the lake, silhouetted against the sky, is one of the most iconic images in film history. The pottery wheel scene in Ghost, with Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers playing on the soundtrack, made an entire generation weep. These moments are embedded in the collective memory, and they remain there because Swayze brought an emotional honesty to them that elevated what could have been disposable entertainment into something genuinely moving. He was also a trained dancer who had studied with the Joffrey Ballet and Harkness Ballet, and a credible action star appearing in Point Break opposite Keanu Reeves in Roadhouse, a film that has only grown in cult status over the decades. He received a Golden Globe nomination for Ghost and was named People magazine's Sexiest Man Alive in 1991. He was tougher, more talented, and more versatile than he was often given credit for. His wife, Lisa, later said that what drove him crazy was the assumption that he was just a pretty face. He had worked his whole life to be taken seriously as a performer, and the work shows. In January 2008, Swayze was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, one of the most lethal forms of the disease. The prognosis was grim, months, not years. But Swayze fought it with everything he had, continuing to work and even starring in the television series The Beast during his treatment. He endured chemotherapy, radiation, and experimental procedures, and he did it all publicly, refusing to hide from the disease. He said he was not afraid of death, but that he wanted to live every possible moment. He could not outrun it. Swayze died on September 14, 2009, at the age of 57, with Lisa at his side. According to her account, his last words to her were, "I love you." And that, when all is said and done, is what it comes down to. 40 extraordinary people. 40 lives of fame, talent, struggle, and accomplishment. And in their final moments, so many of them said what all of us hope to say when our own time comes. Something honest, something real, something that the people we leave behind can carry with them into whatever morning follows. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.